Dù gì cũng xa nhau rồi, ngày nào trước không bao đêm gió dần, giờ đã hết rồi, chẳng còn hơi ấm trên đầu môi. Người yêu hơn, giờ đây tiếng yêu phai phôi, chỉ còn những đêm cô đơn dối bời, giọt nước mắt rơi. Lặng nghe dòng thời gian trôi, người hãy quên đi mà đừng yêu em nữa. Nếu anh không còn gì để vương vấn, người hãy quên đi, đừng chờ mong chi nữa. Biết điều gì cho lòng thêm xót xa, vì tình yêu này sẽ chẳng lâu bền. Người còn yêu mình đến không em đến, tình yêu như làn gió không một tên. Người hãy quên em đi. Có nhau trong đời, vì sự sánh đôi vô tư giữa đời, chẳng hề nghĩ ngợi, chỉ cần hai chúng ta mà thôi. Để giờ đây lòng đớn đau khi ai đổi thay, lời hứa dâng tuyệt tan theo khói bay. Mình em trong đây một mình một bao đắng cay, hãy quên đi và đừng yêu em nữa. Nếu anh không còn gì để bằng tay, người hãy quên đi, đừng chờ mong chi nữa. Vì anh thương gì cho lòng thêm xót xa, vì tình yêu này sẽ trong lòng.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to DVAN and SEADC present Poets Fight Back. My name is Phil Nguyen. I'll be your MC for tonight, and as some of y'all might know who are joining us on Facebook Live and on YouTube Live, I'm the producer for Accented Dialogues on Diaspora. Accented is on break right now, and today, on behalf of DVAN, that believes that the stories and aesthetics of a thriving Vietnamese diaspora can unite our global community, and that our mission is to celebrate and foster diasporic Vietnamese literary voices. We know that our complex and diverse stories must be championed and passed on to current and future generations. We are refugees, immigrants, survivors, and descendants, and that our stories must be heard. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation, this fundraising event that we're doing in partnership with the Southeast Asian Development Center that's based in San Francisco in the Bay Area, California. To give y'all a little bit of context for tonight's show, what we're going to be talking about, we'll be joined by several panelists who are of Southeast Asian descent, who are poets, artists, authors, writers. We're going to be discussing a little bit about this rampant rise in anti-Asian, anti-AAPI violence. We'll be talking to both emerging and established Southeast Asian artists, poets, writers, and we'll have a chance to listen to them read from their work and share what they've been, how they've been contributing to our community and how they understand their Southeast Asian identities. Today's event, as I know from our friends at SEADC, would have been an in-person gala where we would have gathered around food and celebrated, brought Southeast Asian folks from around the Bay Area and the United States to come and celebrate and support the programs and services that SEADC puts on. But in lieu of this in-person gala, we're joined here virtually and to talk a little bit more about what the SEADC is, or the Southeast Asian Development Center is, I'd like to welcome Liana Nakashima, who is a Marketing and Development Associate, to tell us a little bit more about SEADC and the fundraiser that we're doing today. Liana?
Hi there, my name is Liana Shaokui Nakashima. I just started as a marketing and development associate April 19th, and I just moved from LA to San Francisco for this job and to move in with my boyfriend of almost 5 years. We want to say thank you to DVAN for hosting this event with us and having a wonderful group of creators to talk about a topic that's really been affecting our community and our families that we support and want to empower from this event. We want to thank you also for the audience for tuning in today. We really appreciate taking your time out of your workday and spending some time with us on this evening. And we're also running a fundraiser today for our organization as a nonprofit. Towards the end, we'll talk more about that. But SEADC has a 44-year history, and we opened in 1977 by Lam Dong, and it was formerly known as Vietnamese Youth Development Center. Um, and we just rebranded to the Southeast Asian Development Center recently. And we basically wanted to encompass more of our clients because it was beyond just Vietnamese folks. And we serve all sorts of people who speak Lao, Cambodian, Khmer, Tagalog, and all sorts of other languages. Our initial mission was to resettle refugees from Vietnam and Southeast Asia and the South in San Francisco. But it kind of changed later on to help more people who are at risk, families, immigrants, and we're located in the Tenderloin on Edie Street. So we're right in the heart of San Francisco. I just came from the center and we just have a summer program going on for our youth. And we're also doing a food distribution that we've been running for the past couple of months in light of COVID-19. And we've been giving culturally relevant food to our clients and a whole bunch of our lineup outside our center, and we get to greet them. And we're also doing a campaign about COVID-19 to inform people who don't actually have access to a lot of the materials that are out there, because a lot of them are in Southeast Asian languages. So we've been doing a lot of translating and creating flyers and social media posts, reaching out to fellow businesses and trying to inform the community about getting vaccinated and sending them the right information in partnership with the San Francisco Department of Public Health and Tipping Point. Our mission is to foster a healthy, thriving, and self-sufficient Southeast Asian American community. And we've been in a nonprofit for 44 years, and we're really grateful for the opportunity to share our mission with DVAN and your community. And we'll head back to Philip, who graciously invited us here and is setting up all the live stream. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Liana, for giving us a little bit of background into the evolution of the CDC Center. I teach at San Francisco State University, and we do a lot of, between the Asian American Studies Department and the CDC, we do a lot of collaboration, and a lot of our students, I think, are go through the CDC youth programs as interns or as volunteers. So I just want to thank you for the work that y'all are doing. And I think that part of today's conversation comes from the way in which we understand how diverse and nuanced Southeast Asian American experience, or Southeast Asian experience in diaspora is. And a lot of that happens through creative expression and through art and through poetry, right? And so for today, I'm so excited to introduce our panelists, our guests who will be joining us today. The first, and I'll go one by one and give them a chance to say hello to the audience before we get into the meat of our conversation for today. Our first panelist, our first guest that I'd like to introduce to the stream is H'Rina DeTroy, who is a Montagnard American writer and teacher. She has a master's degree in journalism and an MFA in creative writing from Hunter College. She was the recipient of the Café Royale Cultural Foundation's Winter 2020 in Literature and the 2019 Emerging Writer Fellowship at Aspen Word in Memoir. She is an adjunct instructor in and around New York City, and she teaches private workshops in creative writing and cultivating creativity. She's also an editor for DVAN's blog, Diasporic. So if you all could please welcome H'Rina DeTroy. H'Rina, are you on? Oh, we might be having some. Oh,
Hi.
there you go.
There we go.
Welcome.
Okay, I thought you were going to turn it on. Whatever.
Oh, you're
hi
good.
everyone. I'm honored to be here and to be part of this important discussion, this crucial and vital discussion.
Great. Thanks so much, H'Rina, and welcome back. I know we've had you on an accented show before, so it's great to be having you as a part of these conversations. And I know you're going to be sharing a little bit more about your work and some of the work that you're doing in the community to continue to grow our capacity as a community too. So welcome. Our next guest, our next panelist is Natalie Nong, who is a 17-year-old Vietnamese American artist. She enjoys making paintings and drawings in hopes of showing beauty in our similarities and differences. She draws inspiration for her artwork from various emotions and ideas that she encounters throughout her life. Please welcome everyone, Natalie Nong. Welcome, Natalie.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I like to make a lot of illustrations, and I do poetry on the side. And yeah, thank you for having me here.
Great, welcome, and it's. I think you're based in the Bay too, right? So shout out to the Bay. Glad to have a local emerging Southeast Asian poet and artist be on the panel for tonight. Our final panelist for tonight's show is Truong Tran. Truong Tran is a Vietnamese American poet and visual artist. He is the author of 5 poetry collections, The Book of Perceptions, Placing the Accents, Dust and Conscience, Within the Margin, and 4-Letter Words. He is also the author of the children's book, Going Home, Coming Home. His poetry collection, Dust and Conscience, was the winner of the San Francisco State Poetry Center Prize. He is a recipient of numerous honors and awards, including a Fund for Poetry grant, 3 San Francisco Arts Commission Cultural Equity grants, and an Intersection for the Arts Writer in Residency Fellowship. He is currently a visiting professor in poetry at Mills College. Everyone, please welcome Truong Tran.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me, Philip, and thank you to DVAN for doing this work. Always amazes me what you all come up with. So thank you.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you all so much, and welcome to the conversation. This incredible fundraiser for CDC. I want to start off with a question for all of you first, and maybe we'll start with you, and Truong. If you could, just talk us through what's been going on through your post-pandemic life. From my standpoint, and Truong, you're one of the OGs of Vietnamese American poetry, and you've been doing this work for a long time, and so we've seen so much going on, from being called the Wuhan flu to all this xenophobia that's happened in the world to against Asian Americans, and the rampant rise in anti-Asian violence now. So how's your pandemic been, and how's it going so far?
I've been teaching during the pandemic. I teach at Mills College in Oakland. If you don't know, Mills College is a liberal arts college that has a predominantly it's a women's college, but it has a co-ed grad program, and I teach them the creative writing MFA program there. It's a struggle because not a struggle in terms of how I exist or how I interact with my students. It's a struggle because we are at a place now where there's the seeds of hate that have been planted are now being sown. And their spring has sprung, and this hatred is very present. And and one of the things that happens is that there's this divisiveness that happens in our communities. I belong to the Vietnamese community, and a lot of Vietnamese people, including my friends, who are very focused on this idea that this is an anti-Asian crime spree that is being enacted by other communities of color. And as an educator and as someone who works intersectionally with other communities, something that I need to remind my students and my community all the time is that all of this is born of white supremacy. Right? All of this. So you may pinpoint to the young man who is enacting violence on an elderly Asian woman, but it is born of white supremacy, and and I think that's what we need to understand, right? And also, all right, I'm gonna say it. We all have to kind of own up to our contribution to this struggle, this idea, this where this moment of reckoning, because we all have, and I as an academic have for many years worked in the service of whiteness.
Right.
And that's something I have to acknowledge, is the way I teach, the way I guide my students through this space. The many times I've said to my students of color, about how they could write in a way that amplifies their voice to the world. What does that mean when I say that? When I ask them to think about the adjustment of their volume or what have you, it is about me saying, how do you make this work more comfortable to the white, listener in the room, to the white reader in the room? When in reality, what I need to say is, those of you who are uncomfortable, sit with this discomfort. Sit with it and know that the person sitting next to you writing this has lived with this discomfort for their entire life. And I think that's where this pandemic, this struggle right now with all this anti-Asian hate, and before that the reckoning that is, Black Lives Matter, all of that is about us recalibrating the way we exist in this world, and how often we've done this almost subconsciously, that we exist and we work in the service of whiteness, and that has to change.
Right. And thank you for that. I mean, I think, so many people, I think as we see anti-Asian hate and violence emerge in the mainstream, right? We see things on John Oliver on the news, et cetera, and it's there's this constant coverage, and it almost becomes, we're almost numb to it now, right? Even though this violence and this hate is happening to our beloved elders and our friends, family members. And I think, Jung, you mentioned this moment of reckoning, right? And I think as we're talking about the pandemic and how we're approaching this new normal, we know that we don't want to go back to normal, right? Because we know that normal is all of those things that you mentioned, right? Is this divisiveness, is this buying into white supremacy, is this mono minority complicitness that I think our community is beginning to really grapple with. And I think, and I feel like, as an educator myself, and I think in ethnic studies and in Asian American studies, I think we were having this conversation, or the news has been having this conversation about critical race theory, right? And how we consider race as a part of ethnic studies and as a part of the curriculum for what students in the younger generation need to learn to be able to understand themselves and their self-consciousness, right? And I think it's more pertinent now than ever that we make this shift and we understand this and we face this moment of reckoning head on as we try to create what this new normal looks like. I'm going to go to H'Rina, because I know you're also an educator in New York, and if you could speak a little bit about how your pandemic has been and how you're shaping this new normal for both you, your students, and your community.
Yeah. I mean, I really appreciate Jung's comments. I mean, I think, and in your comments too, Philip, all of this is so on point. I mean, we are, it keeps feeling like a moment of reckoning. But it keeps getting like jacked up, right? Like we had the pandemic, we had the attacks in Atlanta, which brought to national attention the violence that was being perpetrated on the Asian American community that has been going on. We had George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, and the protests, largest protests around the world. And yeah, it really is. I mean, it's both an exciting moment. It's also a terrifying moment. This critical race theory debate is, it feels very much like, and what I hope is the cracking and the crumbling, or at least, a significant chipping away of this kind of comfort, the comfort zone that, you know, Jung spoke about, which is the comfort and the fragility of whiteness and of white supremacy. And I think that, yeah, it's happening. It's not happening fast enough, but yeah, I mean, as far as my own work, you know, I'm working on the memoir, and you know, a lot of that story is about just the struggle to tell a story. Everyone disappeared. Am I gone? No, everyone's there. Okay. All right. Scared me for a second. You know, the struggle to tell a story, to tell the story of the Montagnard American experience, Montagnard history, which is something that I haven't seen in books, that, you know, the Montagnard American community doesn't necessarily have these books. We don't have these writers. But, you know, obviously part of the work I've been doing is, yeah, that's the memoir, but also, you know, I taught this amazing workshop called Apocalypse Never, writing our origin story and imaginative futures as Montagnard Americans. And that was a phenomenal experience that brought together 9 Montagnard Americans from all over the country, many of them in North Carolina, which is where our largest community is. And, you know, did the radical thing of writing our stories. I mean, if we don't have a section in a library, if we don't have a section in bookstores, then the most radical thing to do is write our stories, and write our stories now. So, I mean, I think, you know, so much about violence is that it's so hard to sit with it, to exist in it, to witness it. You know, like biologically, you know, our mind just wants to get away, to kind of get back to a space in which you feel comfortable and you feel safe, right? And I think that there's a lot of, I mean, I feel like there's a lot of kind of that happening. I mean, even like in my artistic process, or even in kind of teaching, it's like there is so much heavy shit going on. But it's been amazing and beautiful to try to create these spaces in which writers are exploring, and writers are exploring their stories, their histories, their lives. So that was, you know, I was honored to be able to facilitate that through Apocalypse Never. More recently, I taught something called Multiverses, Writing Our Immigrant Origin Stories. I'm teaching another session of that starting June 30th. Most of my students were of Asian American descent, or Asian Americans. And I think, you know, I do have to wonder if there is kind of a push or a kind of a compulsion to tell our stories, to explore art. I think, you know, I'll just say that, like, I once knew there was a Vietnamese woman that I used to work with a long time ago at the Fashion Institute. And she was a bit older. She was also born in the Central Highlands, but she was Vietnamese American. And I remember one thing she said to me has always stuck with me. And she said, you know, it's interesting, like with Vietnamese Americans, we don't necessarily kind of perpetuate the model minority myth so well. She's like, a lot of people that I know are artists, they're poets, they're dancers, you know, and as if to say that having survived generations of war, centuries of war, there is a need to express and to engage with art. And I, if that is true, I think it's beautiful, it's important, and I also think it is to a degree an answer to all this violence.
Right. And I think as we're thinking about how to address this discomfort and the ways that we feel both excited about what's to come, but also terrified about what's happening, I that sits with me too, because I think that for a long time I've thought about, how Vietnamese American or folks in diaspora, Southeast Asian Americans are in their own right poets. And I think that might come from us, having come from this oral history, right? Like I know that like I still remember the melodies of songs that my parents and my grandparents sang to me, and a lot of what they had spoken to me in their own, in Vietnamese has sounded as though it was poetic in a way, not like formal poetry, but in a way poetic, in a way that speaks to me and resonated to me, and is something that I hope to pass on to future generations. And I think, the work that we're doing to amplify and to be the ones that are pushing the boundaries for what it means to be, Vietnamese American, Montagnard American, Southeast Asian American, et cetera, happen in the community, right? Like I think it's easy to be caught up in the academy and the ivory tower, and I think we're gonna get there. I think to thinking about what our work looks like in community, and as I think about also what the next generation is doing, what it means when we say there are emerging writers, artists, authors, creators, right? I want to pitch it to Natalie to talk a little bit about how you've been addressing face first or face front in affronting or addressing head first all this anti-API violence that has been going on, this movement. As someone who is just 17, right?
Yeah. I would definitely say it's been rough in the pandemic, especially because everything is so focused on social media when you're at home all the time, and there's just a constant stream of anti-Asian hate, anti-Asian violence in the news every single day, and it gets very overwhelming very quickly. And so I know for me, like during the pandemic, it was tough trying to go from understanding everything that was happening to then trying to find a way to take action about what was happening. So for me, to help me understand, was just like with school. So for the past year, I've taken an ethnic studies class, and also we have like my English class. We had a project to write a research paper on a current social issue. And so a lot of it, I did a lot of extensive research on anti-Asian hate and what it's looked like in the past. And, a lot of it is rooted in white supremacy. A lot of the hate crimes that we are seeing today is very much similar to hate crimes that have happened in the past with the Chinese Exclusion Act, with blaming like Chinese immigrant workers for like bubonic plagues, the burning of Chinatowns. It's a lot of history that I didn't know about before the pandemic. And so now I guess it's more of just trying to focus on how to get the voices of the youth to be heard and to be listened. Just from my perspective, I feel like I've always been taught to sort of like stay quiet, stay out of trouble, like not, cause too much, I don't know the word, but not, stir up too much trouble for people. And so now it's like trying to use different outlets to express the thoughts and opinions that I've been having, because there's a lot going on that I think needs to be expressed in like many different ways.
Right. And I think we'll have a chance to hear about all of your artistic expressions a little bit later into our conversation. And as we're talking about how we're faced with this Asian violence, I also want to ask you all each, was there a moment where you feel as though you became Vietnamese American, Southeast Asian American, Asian American? Like, was there this moment of becoming that you can pinpoint? And I think for me, as I think about like to be Asian American, I think also comes from like knowing that you are different. That Asian American has never really equated to this idea of like you know, stars and stripes, playing football, whatever Andrew Yang says Asian Americans are supposed to be like, right? Just a subtle jab, but you know,
Jab away.
and there's all these moments, that these lunchbox moments, right, that people talk about, where it's like, oh, my food smelled like minuk mam, and you know, people, and that for me was a moment where I felt different. Was there a moment for each of you? And I'll start with H'Rina, if you wouldn't mind.
So the question is the moment of embracing Asian Americanness, or just feeling different, or
yeah, like your moment of self-consciousness.
I mean, I think what's a little, you know, what's, I guess, unusual or maybe perhaps different from folks maybe on this panel, I don't know. You know, I grew up in Connecticut, so I grew up where there was not a large Asian American community. And I'm biracial, so most people thought I was Latina or Puerto Rican. And I kind of like played along with that because it meant that I actually belonged to something growing up, you know. And then I went to college in Eugene, Oregon. I went to the U of O, and then I quickly transferred to the community college out there. But it was the first time I actually was around Asian Americans, and it was like an enlightening experience. It's kind of like the Zorro, you know, my eyes were watching God moment of Zora Neale Hurston, where, you know, she looks in the mirror and at that point she realizes, you know, she's Black, you know, and it's like I went out there, and then all of a sudden I realized that like I've been missing this Asian American identity in consciousness. And I kind of just jumped headfirst into it. I went kind of bananas, honestly. I joined like the Vietnamese like student union and like the Asian American student union, and I got super into student organizing. And then I started a chapter of the Asian Pacific American Student Union. And yeah, I mean, I will also say that reading, like I read Catfish and Mandala by Andrew X. Pham. That was a Christmas present from my dad and stepmother. I got that, I think, when I was like 17 or 18 years old. And I realized at that moment, I was like, I've never read a book by an Asian American. I've never read a book by a Vietnamese author or a Vietnamese American author. And at that point, I was like, it just blew me away. I didn't even realize what I was missing until I found it.
Catfish and Mandala. That was
my book.
Mine was I Love You Zephyr White People by Laksu.
That's an amazing book. Laksu,
yeah, which like
kind
of came out at the same time, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And actually one of my mentors, Isabel Tuipolo, who can't be here with us tonight, is one of the co-founders of DVAN. Her book, This Is All I Choose to Tell, when I was reading it for the first time, and it kind of opened my eyes to the world of Vietnamese American literature. I noticed that title is actually from Anh Trung, one of your poems, right? Like she also takes a lot of inspiration from you, and Trung Hoàng Trung, right, and all these other folks that were coming out there and, you know, making the path while walking, right? So was there a moment for you, Anh Trung, you know, where back in the day where you emerged as an Asian American, Southeast Asian American, Vietnamese American?
You know, to pinpoint it to a moment is to somehow locate it to pass. And the truth for me is that it's a lifetime of reconditioning or unlearning the conditions by which we exist. And that's something that I'm still doing to this day. I'll give you an example, though. As like not too long ago, I was deposed because I had the audacity to sue an institution for what I thought was clear discrimination. And so, you know, I was deposed. I was brought into a room, and the room was filled with white men. Every single one of them was white, including my lawyer, sitting there taking notes. And I sat there and I waited. And the person who walked into the room ever so slightly late and almost as if this was a play that was being enacted to an audience was a Vietnamese woman. And the Vietnamese woman walked in and she did the work of deposing me. And if you can imagine a room full of white men taking notes as two Vietnamese immigrants of about the same age, sitting here debating the constitution of what is and is not racism and discrimination to an audience of white men. This was the reality of our existence. And at some point in this conversation, I really wanted to ask her a question. And the question is one that I've been asked often, and I've taken offense to, which is the question of where are you from? Right? We are asked that often as immigrant others in this country. But I want to ask her as a fellow Vietnamese, because that is a question that my parents often ask of other Vietnamese people. Not because it was followed with the understanding that you're not from here, go home, but because it was a way of connecting with one's community. Where are you from? Right? I wanted to ask her that question. I didn't get the chance to ask that question. I was in no position to ask that question, but it stayed with me, and that was a moment that I one of many moments, one of a lifetime of moments where I realize how I am in this space, always put in a position where I'm expected to perform my otherness to this country and to this land and to an audience of white gazes.
Right. And I think, the sentiment behind where are you from, for me, I feel like it's been followed up with where are you really from, right? Because to answer, for me, Lancaster, California, SoCal, NorCal, wherever it may be, it was never really enough, right? And I think, I feel as you're retelling the story and doing, like, I feel the white gaze upon me too, right? And to know that I am this double consciousness that Ellison speaks about, right? Like, to know that you are different, and to in that difference understand that, when when Vietnamese people ask you where are you from, right? It's flipped on itself, right? It's asking where is your homeland, where is your way, to acknowledge that we as a people have been displaced and that are living in diaspora, and in somehow, some way can connect to each other in that difference, I think is incredibly powerful. For you, Natalie, has there been that moment for you where you've come to understand your own identity as a Southeast Asian American, Vietnamese American?
Yeah. I think there were always like small moments growing up where I knew like I was different. Whether it was like the people I would call my friends would make jokes, like mocking broken English, or, like making like jokes about eating dog, or like any of those kind of jokes. Those always felt really othering to me, especially since I'd confront them and they'd be like, oh, we're not talking about you, or trying to like make it seem like better than what they intended. Other times it would be like watching movies or watching TV shows and not seeing Southeast Asians on the screen, or it would mainly be like East Asians on the screen, and it would feel very like othering. And so a lot of it, I think, during the pandemic, I had a lot of time to do a lot of self-reflection, and I had a lot of time to really understand what it meant to be Vietnamese American. And a lot of it was understanding that I am different, and that people will not always see me as American, and that there's always going to be this idea of like the perpetual foreigner where you don't always belong. And so a lot of it was just trying to understand that and knowing how to move forward with that. you know, when people ask me like, where are you from? I'm always like, I was born in California, but my family is from Vietnam, if that's what you meant. And a lot of it is just sort of educating people in those small ways, and trying to normalize the idea that like Asian Americans are Americans, even if they don't look it or act like it, whatever. But yeah, it's tough, but I think it's more about pushing through it.
Natalie, I just want to commend you for confronting the moment, because someone of my generation didn't so much confront it as so much as laugh along with it. So I'm glad to hear that you're confronting it. Otherwise, you might end up with an angry old fart like me.
And Natalie, I mean, if you wouldn't mind starting us off, I know each of y'all have prepared work to read, and I think this is a perfect moment to segue into if you wouldn't mind reading the work that you shared with us, healing for the young Asian girl, which I think is in the flow of the conversation, in this understanding of how to unapologetically be Asian American, especially in this moment. So I'll pass the mic back to you.
Yeah. Okay. So the poem I wrote was in response to the Atlanta shootings at the time, and I was really struggling with how to process everything that was going on. So I'll just read it. To the young Asian girl who is struggling with how to process your pain right now, I want to tell you that it's okay. That the anger or hurt you may feel is valid and that you deserve to be acknowledged and seen. To the young Asian girl who wants to speak up but finds that your voice gets lodged in your throat and you feel as though you can't breathe, I am sorry. I am sorry for the pain you are in right now, and I know that you hate crying, but it's okay if you have to. Crying will not make you weak, and you will not be playing into that sick stereotype of a submissive Asian woman, so allow yourself to feel, to scream, to rant, allow yourself to heal because you deserve it. To the young Asian girl who feels fetishized and sexualized, you are human. You deserve to feel safe in your own skin, and I'm sorry that that sense of security was stolen from you, but know that you can take it back because you are stronger than what you may think right now. To the young Asian girl who feels ignored, who feels like people won't listen to your warnings or protests unless someone gets hurt or ends up murdered, your voice matters. It always has and always will, and people will eventually be forced to listen to what you have to say, so do not silence yourself for the comfort of others. To the young Asian girl who knows that this type of violence isn't new, who knows the history of Yellow Peril, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and the countless other times Asian bodies have been brutalized and beaten throughout history, please stay strong. It may feel like you want to give up, that people will forever choose to stay ignorant, but in that case, please put yourself first. It is not your job to educate others on your pain or your history. You are not a resource. You are a human being and deserve to be treated as such. To the young Asian girl who feels exhausted and drained and can't help but feel like you're drowning in the news of the daily hate crimes you see online, it is okay to unplug, to log off, to return to yourself and find peace with your loved ones. The young Asian girl writing this poem as a form of healing and processing, know that you are loved, that you are appreciated, that you are not a model minority or a scapegoat or a fetish. Know that feeling pain doesn't make you weak. Know that you are allowed to rest and heal for however long you need. Thank you.
Whew.
That was great. Thank you for sharing that, Natalie.
Thank you, Natalie.
Yes, thank you so much. And I think hopefully to everyone who's watching with us live and to those who watch us later, to all those young Asian girls, you're an inspiration. You know, thank you so much for your work. And I know, Natalie, you also shared with us, you know, your form, your medium is not just poetry, right? You also shared with us some graphic work that you've done. So if you wouldn't mind speaking to that as I pull it up.
Yeah. So I also make a lot of digital artworks. Right now I'm working on like an original story of mine for fun. And it's like fantasy storytelling. but the focus is more on like Southeast Asian characters, since there's not really a lot of representation in that genre. And so a lot of like the environments that you see here, this was all inspired by, like, whenever I would go to visit Vietnam, I always really loved the nature and the environments, and the scenery was always really beautiful to me. And so I wanted to create visual like illustrations that would represent Vietnamese culture in some aspect. So yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, this is beautiful. I'm like, let me try to pull it back up. So what were you inspired for this piece, which I think you titled The Ruins?
Yeah. So this one, most of my family lives in like South Vietnam, so like Saigon, or we also have family that lives on the countryside too. So there's a lot of trees, there's a lot of plants, and a lot of it. So this one, it's supposed to be like a specific moment in my story where like this character finds this new fun imaginary place, and like it's the place that she's been looking for like for the whole story. And so I wanted to make it have some resemblance of the time that I've been to Vietnam, of like, you know, driving by on a motorcycle and seeing all of like the buildings that were like sort of broken down, but they also had a lot of like greenery growing around it. And yeah.
And then you have Celeste, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this one I wanted to do more of like more fantasy aspect to it. So I just went creative with this one. It's very loosely based off like Vietnam, so it's not too much inspiration, but I just had fun with it. So yeah.
Right. Thanks so much for that. I think it's so incredible. I mean, for me, as someone whose parents came here as refugees, and for 30 plus, I think almost 30 years, neither my parents nor I have returned home to Vietnam, to that place that they came from. I think it's really incredible to see how that return inspired your work, right? And at the same time, listen to your poem and see how living in this adopted homeland, right, which is, I think you mentioned earlier, where you were born, right, in California, shapes your understanding and identity of who you are. I guess I want to pitch this one to Andrew, because you were one of the first people, right, that started to talk about what, I mean, the way in which your poetry addresses this linkage, right, this connection to this homeland far away, as well as the way in which we've been marked by war. And I think the blood and lineage of being Vietnamese has to do with division. And not so often do we ever talk about the things that, in pain and in suffering, the sacrifice and silence that we experience. Do we ever talk about what healing looks like? So if you wouldn't mind speaking to that, and the way that, this your own trajectory of your work, right? Like five poetry books later and a children's book, what insights have you come to hold about this Vietnamese American, Southeast Asian American identity?
That's a really interesting question, and I don't know if I have the answer. Maybe because I don't know if I'm qualified to guide in the process of healing. What I do know is that the work documents, and documentation in some ways for me is a valuable tool. It's a way of fighting against the erasure, right? And I think as a person of color, as someone who is marginalized in this society, there is an invisible hand that erases us. And so the act of writing, the act of making art, is a way to push back against that. This whole conversation that we started with, the notion of critical race theory. it is really another form of erasure that's happening right now, right? And the reality is, critical race theory is who I am. It's what I do. It's
Yep.
my teaching.
Right.
I teach this with every ounce of my being. So the hell of that, right? I don't need to have that conversation with these people. It's who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a part of my existence and my DNA for all intents purposes. So I do this because I believe that writing is the act of writing oneself back into existence.
Mm.
For me as a person of color, right? So that's where I'm at, and I write because we encounter moments of erasure, right? Instances where our culture, our identity, our very lives are being erased. And so we write in a way of saying, hey, we're still present.
Right. H'Rina, I see you snapping with the poetic vibes in here. I mean, do you feel the same? I mean, I know that, because I have your work queued up, and I also have ready for you to talk about this multiverse that you're creating, right? But are we fighting against erasure, and how are we doing that? How are you doing that?
I mean, the audacity to create art in a hyper-capitalist system is, that compulsion and that need to like fight, scream, demand, and that we're here, that we exist, that are, it's not even like this thing. It's like, do our voices matter? I mean, it's beyond that. It's like our voices are the voices. We are doing, this is vital, crucial work. I feel like, we're kind of in a literary moment where there's a lot of Southeast Asian artists are, they're getting a lot of visibility, which is great, and it's amazing. And I think it's one of these moments where, the United States, this country, the West is really having to, it really has to face its history and its legacy of violence and of imperialism. And I feel like we're at a moment where, I feel like everyone on this panel feels like just pushback and this demand to be seen. This is the work that we've always been doing. It's why we get up. It's why we do. It's why we teach. It's why we write. But it feels like there is kind of a cultural collective shift to acknowledging that this work is important, and I celebrate that. But yeah, I'm pushing against erasure. I mean, especially as a Montagnard person, where our voices have been erased not only in the American context but also in the Vietnamese context. Vietnam has tried to erase Montagnard and ethnic minority existence. At least for the last 100 years, they've been pretty adamant about it. Then after the war, it's been, there's this constant push or, there's constant pressure that like everyone there is like a happy communist and everything. So much of my work is about acknowledging that. It's about learning how we have been erased and pushing back against that.
Right, and I mean, I wanna just highlight, you know, the series of workshops that you have going on, and I think from coming from Apocalypse Never, writing our origin stories and imaginative futures as Montagnard Americans, you're now working on this multiverses, writing our immigrant origin stories, right? So, can you talk a little bit more about this focus on origin stories, right? Like how is that we're that origin stories comes to be where you locate your workshop, and if you could give us a sneak preview into what you're going to be talking about next week.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's interesting, this idea of like, what is our origin story? I feel like we all have different ideas. I mean, it's similar to the question that you posed earlier, Philip, where it's like, at what moment did you realize that you were Asian American? And I think that it's a really powerful question to ask and then unpack in writing. You know, at what point did you realize that your identity as you know, what was your identity as an immigrant, and how does that create your worldview? And that's the idea behind the title, Multiverses. There's many universes that we are living, and we all have these different perspectives. And so much of this workshop is about the idea that, you know, it pushes against this idea of the kind of typical American immigrant story, which, you know, we've heard time in, you know, forever, where, you know, the turn of the century kind of 1920s immigrant story from Europe. That's something that we know quite well. We know that history. I think it's really interesting to kind of pose, you know, a post-World War II perspective. You know, there's all these migrations that came, all these refugees that came after World War II, after, you know, the United States was confident, and it kind of it was a moment of kind of taking on the work of the imperialist. It wasn't just the UK at that point. At this point, it becomes the United States, right? And what is the result of that? Well, here we are. And I think that it's you know, I think when it comes to this workshop, what I encourage the participants to do is to think about how our stories don't fit into these like neat, you know, kind of formulaic stories about what an immigrant story is. You know, I don't think, you know, there are so many questions about identity. And then there is, for so many folks, just like we're talking about, you will always be considered a foreigner. You will always be other than this country, right? So at that point, you know, is your immigrant story the same as, you know, an Italian immigrant who came in the 1920s? I don't think so. I think that there is a more complex and nuanced story to explore in there. And so that is, that's the basis of Multiverses. Yeah, and as far as what's going to be the first, you know, writing prompt, I don't know. I like to kind of keep it fresh, keep it interesting, see what I'm inspired to do. But yeah, you know, I think when I start these workshops, a lot of times the students or like the participants are folks who have maybe never written before. So we go over, you know, creative writing basics, like, you know, evocative writing, evocative description, how to create scenes, things like that. It's a lot of fun.
Right. Thanks, H'Rina, for sharing that. And you know, for the plug, check H'Rina out, H'Rina DeTroy. We'll drop the link to your website in the comments. And you know, you've been an inspiration to us, and we want you to keep coming back, and we want you to keep helping us frame, shape, and also create the narrative of Southeast Asian Americans that we're pushing out into the world, right? To bring the margins into the center, as one might put it. And so I know you have a a piece that you wrote with / about your mother, about your own origin story. So I'm gonna pass it on to you if you wouldn't mind sharing bottlenecks, my mother's walks, and other perils with us.
Great. Yes. Okay. So I am reading it from the website. Okay. So bottlenecks, my mother's walks, and other perils. Inexplicably, I was haunted by a puddle of sand. In the Connecticut town where my mother lived, close to where I had grown up, a small bit of sidewalk dipped and crumbled. I had stepped around it on holiday and birthday visits, a thing unworthy of note. Before the pandemic, my mother and I took walks. A temporary truce to our bickering, physical activity, and fresh air made us better. After a row of lichened maples, we'd pass over this rundown and sandy patch before looping cul-de-sacs and slipping quickly past the cemetery on a hill. The quiet grave markers made my mother nervous because she believed in ghosts. The sidewalk was a sidewalk, unmemorable, yet my mind fixated over this deteriorating asphalt bank ever since I started to make a string of phone calls to my mother in March 2020 about the coronavirus. Normally, for important matters, I would make the 2-hour commute from Brooklyn to her low-income housing unit to explain things in person. But with the lockdown, I resorted to dialing my mother with almost daily reminders to use hand sanitizer, wash her hands obsessively, and call immediately if she developed a dry cough with fever. Nonplussed, my mother complained that the YMCA was closed. She missed swimming her laps. I'm not going to stay cooped up inside, my mother told me on the phone one late afternoon. Everyone's out walking, she said. I said, you need to at least wrap a scarf around your face, Mom, gazing out my home office window and watching dusk creep over the neighboring brownstones. Mom, you should only walk where there aren't a lot of people, I said. But no one is wearing a mask, she yelled at me. You can't stop me from walking, she said. No one was trying to stop her, I repeated. This was a point we retreaded, our communication a rut. You can't stop me, she insisted before hanging up. I had been the one who hung up the time before. My sister also phoned with reminders, so my mother must have felt we were harassing her. But until I had confirmation that she took COVID seriously, communication became a standoff, usually until one was left listening to the dial tone. After these seemingly futile phone calls, the sidewalk materialized in my mind. Communication between me and my mother has always been fraught for 2 reasons. First, English wasn't her first language, but it was the only one we shared. More so, we often lacked a common cultural context. She emigrated to America 45 years ago from an ethnic minority Montagnard hamlet in Vietnam. The life she had been born into was one of tending crops and animals, where a 5th grade education sufficed. Like many first-gen kids, I grew up translating signs, forms, and reformulating what the bank teller said. But only later as an adult would I begin to understand how much our miscommunication and strife depended on my assumptions that we shared the same knowledge about the same things. Example, over the phone with my mother, already riled up and rowdy, how do I convey that she needs to maintain 6 feet from others? Could I assume she was familiar with the size of 1 foot? Sure, Vietnam followed the metric system, but could I assume any standardized measurement had been useful to her specifically? Our second communication barrier was schizophrenia and the disorientation that came with it. My mother was diagnosed after my sister and I were well into adulthood, although I had been a kid when I learned how her eyes darting quickly to the side meant that she was listening to voices only she could hear. Schizophrenia affected cognition, her ability to arrive at rational cause and effect conclusions. I'd lose my patience when our conversations looped endlessly. I phoned my mother again a few days later. My mother said it was packed, giddiness in her voice as she described her trip to Trader Joe's. But as is often the case when my mother tries to assure me that all is well and normal, I'm cycling through panic and dread. Immediately, I pictured my mother wandering around for hours, attention utterly scattered. The usual Trader Joe's trip was a feat of executive functioning for anyone, with its carefully calculated array of shiny products and tropical palettes, inviting samples and free shots of caffeine. The extra layer of awareness needed in the era of COVID, the hypervigilance to avoid touching the face or quickly rubbing her eye, would be, for my mother, an impossibility. Ordering her groceries was a thing I couldn't afford either. The wind blustered outside my window in Brooklyn, dampening the constant wail of ambulances, sirens momentarily. The spiraling black hole of what-ifs made it impossible for me to sit. I paced. The image of the sidewalk appeared. I remembered it as a bottleneck, a somatic memory of bodily tension. Before the pandemic, I had watched my mother, unaware and spacey, amble along this uneven patch many times as other strollers tried to pass around us quickly. One or two huffed impatiently. Was I conflating that tension with a new one? Was I worried about her physical proximity to someone with COVID? Or was it something else? She didn't look East Asian, I reassured myself. The people in her predominantly white and wealthy town might mistake her for Indian, Dominican, or Hawaiian for her darker skin. Inevitably, my mind went there and weighed the possibility that she would be perceived as Asian in a time of anti-Asian racism, while living in a town where she was already highly visible and refused to wear a mask. Half white, I had grown up ambivalent about identity until I embraced Asian Americanness boldly in college. And yet here I was, meek in my hope that my mother was undetectable as an Asian person. When mysterious dents and a cracked windshield suddenly appeared on her car last year, she paid for quick repairs, afraid of what people might think of the unsightly damage to her 1995 Nissan. Did the sidewalk haunt me? Or was it the feeling of being powerless to aggression around her? Was the scary invisible thing in the air the coronavirus? Or was it the volatility of fear as an emotion and how it could suddenly expand like gas in a bottle, ready to pop, a reactivity that found its release in violence? I'll just stop there because I feel like I'm taking up a lot of time.
You're good, H'Rina. I mean, I'm like lost in your words right now as I'm like looking at it, and the link is also posted in the chat. But thank you so much. I'm just gonna, hit you with some of the poetic, the poetic snaps. Get the vibes right. Some of the things that I think stuck out to me, and I'm also gonna pivot to the panelists too if y'all want to share your thoughts. But this role of the second generation, the child of refugee immigrants playing as interpreter translator, I think really stuck out to me. And this I mean, you elucidate what the generational gap in communication feels like. And I think for me, like, to understand this fleeting sense of home and this fleeting sense of like who I am and what I can do to be there for my parents might not ever really stick with them. And there's so many of their ghosts that they're facing are the ghosts that I confront. And I think that is so beautiful. It's so beautifully terrifying, right? So I want to thank you for sharing with us. And Truong and Natalie, if you would like to also share some thoughts.
Well, go ahead, Natalie. You should go.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say, like, I really related to a lot of parts, especially like the first generation and child of immigrants and having the different cultural contexts. Because I often find myself, like, whenever I talk to my parents or I talk to my family, there's a disconnect, which can often lead to frustration and impatience. And it's always like getting angry, but then feeling bad that you got angry. And it's just, it was just, I really liked your essay, and it was very relatable to me. So.
There's that constant pendulum swing between like anger and guilt, and anger and guilt, like frustration and guilt. And yeah, I feel like that's very much like a first gen experience for sure.
Somewhere in between that too is interestingly enough for me is this notion of power. Language is power in the society, right? I was also my mother's interpreter when I was growing up, but as a 7-year-old gay boy interpreting for my mother, I wielded incredible power in some way. I told the young boys from church who came to have their clothes made by my mother to go into the back room and strip. But my mother could measure them, right? And they would come out. There was something strangely happening in that dynamic where this 17-year-old boy is being told by this woman who I think that he's probably finding attractive in that moment to follow her commands. But only it wasn't her commands, it was my command.
That's amazing.
You know, my poor mother would be screaming in Vietnamese, "What's wrong with these white boys? Like taking off their clothes and what have you." And I was, as a 7-year-old, wielding that power over language. And I think that's something that we as writers and artists come to recognize constantly, this idea that how we hold that power of language in our hands and how we manipulate it for good or for bad. But I think that was really, really, I by no means am I saying you manipulate for good or for bad, but that there was that kind of strange existence between one and the other in that bridge of language. You know, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's, what is so kind of ineffable and just terrifying about like the moment that we're in is just how that anger is being not even necessarily always being directed at us. I'm like, okay, I'm a young person. If you want to, throw some slurs at me, okay, I'll deal with it the way I need to deal with it. But the idea that it's targeting elders is like deeply fucked up, right? And it's deeply terrifying. Sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to curse, but yeah, okay. And just because, when I think about someone like my mom, she's got spice to her. She's but at the same time, she knows that safety comes from being deferential. And so like that, those are the things that terrify me. And just this idea of like, in a town that's considered safe, it's not necessarily safe for everyone. So yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a line in your essay, H'Rina. And what about how easily I abandoned my sense of identity and community in the face of racism, the knee-jerk response to a threat and predictable story of divide and conquer? Was that not a thing to fear also, right? And I think back to this divide and conquer politics, right? And how we, as Asian Americans, as Southeast Asian Americans, we continue to be, this is the way that we are both oppressed, and the way that we, in our complicity to this white supremacy, to this whiteness, oppress each other and ourselves, and in the process, right? We recolonize, right? Or buy into this imperialist narrative that it is us that needs to be erased, right? It is us that needs to erase ourselves to become something that which they think we are, right? And I think this feeling of otherness, right, I think is something that all of you have discussed today, right? This feeling of estrangement from yourself, to see yourself as both, but it's to really understand this feeling of being othered, right? And how poignant it is to this moment now that we feel in being othered is that we also understand this power, Anjung, right, that you're talking about, that we wield as the other, right? And I want to pivot it to you, and I know that Kaya Press, who DVAN is actually partnering with, to put together a print, Ink and Blood. It will be publishing a new book of poetry that you have forthcoming in October 21 called Book of the Other. And I also understand, Anjung, that you'll be reading an excerpt or a poem from that book. So if you wouldn't mind speaking to us about Book of the Other, that is going to be coming out in October 2021.
Thank you. First and foremost, I want to state that the idea of recognizing your otherness is different from the performance of your otherness, right? Which is the expectation that the world and the white gaze wants. They want to see. They want to like receive that performance of otherness, and in that way, we as immigrants, we as marginalized members of this society are always put into that position of performing otherness, right? And the challenge for me is to you can't get off that stage sometimes. The reality is that, even as you walk off a stage, another one extends itself right before you, and you're always somehow finding yourself on the stage. The challenge is, how do you subvert that stage? How do you do something that is unexpected of your performance in that moment? And this book is an attempt to do that. I should say that Kaya is the only Asian diasporic press in the United States. And this book has been in the works for almost 15 years. And it had been held by many other presses, 3 that all expressed interest, but all ultimately backed off because they were so very uncomfortable with the subjectivity of this book.
Wow.
And so I'm fortunate that Kaya is the publisher, because Kaya actually pushed me to have some really hard conversations about this text. And it's coming out in October. So I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from that. And I'm going to start with the footnote to this piece. I question the word. I question this poem. I question if I even have the right to say this word, to write this poem. Someone will question the language of this poem, of this book. That is to be expected. But if this is not clear, if I am not clear, this is anger. I am angry. I wake up angry because my mother calls at 8 a.m. I wake up angry. Someone is dying all the time. And the word is motherfucker. In the course of this book, the word is used deliberately in excess. The word is used and someone laughed. The word is used in a sentence out of anger. The word is used as metaphoric violence. The word is used and someone is offended. The word is used in context of the mother. My mother, if she knew, if translated, I think my mother would approve of this word. The word interrupts in the course of this book. The word, I'm told, is just the word. She calls every day at 8 a.m. My mother insists on interrupting my sleep. The word, I'm told, is just the word. She calls at 8 a.m. My mother insists on interrupting my sleep. I'm sorry, I just repeated that. My mother says she is my alarm clock. A Vietnamese man died this week, stabbed in the heart. My mother calls to tell me this. The word is used because I do not have another word. Written again into this book, this need to wake. My mother calls to know that I am alive. This man who died, I wonder if his mother is still awake. Another Vietnamese man is killed in the same week. My mother calls with news of his death. She calls to wake. She won't stop watching. 8 in the morning, and my mother calls with gruesome details of how a Vietnamese man was killed and dismembered. The word is interrupting even now. My mother tells me the man they killed was about my age. He was 55 years old. My mother forgets how old I am. My mother tells me the boys who killed him are white and the age of my students. In the course of this book, I am thinking about the word and its use. By changing a letter, I am attempting to temper the word. This word I know is not just a word. I think about my mother all the time, of the 8 a.m. wakes she is fated to hold again and again. For the mothers of those who have been hurt and killed, and the mothers of those who hurt and kill, the word, my mother, the mother of the word. And then this is a piece that is, in fact, a footnote to something else. What is enough? How will I live? What is enough? How will I live? This declaration, these are the only two questions I want to answer. Ask of myself. Last night I went to bed and slept continuously for a duration of 8 hours. I can't remember the last time I've been able to sleep seamlessly through a night. I woke up this morning feeling rested and, dare I say it, hopeful. As the day progressed, this hope, it comes. As I move my body through the world, slowly, this hope, it goes. News of a mass shooting after a year of absence. This is normalizing. This is waking. These questions, they keep on coming back. What is enough? How will I live? I water the plants in my garden. In other news, an elderly Asian woman fights back. She sends her assailant to the hospital. People are sharing this as celebration. The clip of her crying, confused, saying, "The bum, he hit me for no reason." These are not her words exactly. They are the English captions of a life translated. This woman, I see my mother from a distance. What is enough? I potted a tree. I bought a bag of vegetables. How will I live? I'm writing these words. I'm breathing through a mask. What is enough? My former students have been sending notes. How are you doing? Please be careful. Sending you hugs. Fuck them, Truong. I'm thinking of buying you some pepper spray. And so I carry a stick for protection. I'm walking, even if it's only to the thrift store and back. I'm still pretty tough, and still I'm afraid of walking down the street. What is enough? It comes and it goes. How will I live? This hope. I'm walking every day. Thank you.
Whew.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, June. And
Thank you.
You know,
Thank you.
It's incredible. I think as we started off talking about this moment of reckoning for the world, right? And I think somewhere along the way we talked about our own moment of reckoning and of becoming. And then I think now we've gotten to a point where we're talking about hope, right? What hope looks like for the future, and where we pivot from this moment into creating what it means to, live in the world as a Vietnamese American, Southeast Asian American, Asian American, right? And in so many ways, the way in which you all have expressed your art, your work is how we fight back, right? Is how we fight back against the mainstream, how we fight back against whiteness, and how we fight back against all which has oppressed us, right? And we speak to these experiences, these intersectional experiences of what it means to be an immigrant, to be a refugee, to be queer, to be a woman, et cetera, right? And I think in that way, we and you all are paving the path for everyone that is to come, right? I want to, we're going to welcome back Liana in a bit to talk a little bit more about this SEADC fundraiser. But from DVAN's end, I just want to say thank you to all of you for sharing your work, for sharing your experiences, and for being here on this this virtual conversation that we're having today. We're gonna be getting into the Q&A in a bit, and so for those of y'all that are following along on Facebook, let us know if you have any questions for any of the panelists from tonight. My first question for y'all, and my question before we bring up the audience questions is, could y'all speak to your inspirations, motivations, and aspirations? So who is it that inspires you? What is it that continues to motivate you to do the work that you do? And what's next for you? Where can we find you? How do we connect with you? I'll start with Jung on this one and go from Jung to H'Rina to Natalie.
I started in my 20s wanting to be a writer, and I had many inspirations. I have to say, very few of them were, Asian Americans or Vietnamese. I grew up reading, American literature. 20 years later, I don't have very many inspirations in terms of the white world and the writers. What I have is a desire to exist and survive, and what I experienced was the reality of erasure. It's like my story is known to some about being in this web of discrimination or whatever that I was trying to fight against, and really being put into a container of silence, right? So this book, which is my last book that I published, was in 2008, and it's because I felt like after that experience I couldn't write. I couldn't, not that I didn't write, but I couldn't write and put my work out into the world. This book coming out in 2021 is the book where I write myself back into existence. And I write myself out of silence, and I write as a way of confronting. Fuck the academy in that way, because and Philip, you and I exist in the same space, but it's like someone said to me after reading this book, someone who is an academic himself, and said, this book, I have to tell you, is tantamount to career suicide. And I said, what is career suicide in the face of death by silence? Right. So where I'm at, and probably this will be more fuel for someone to try to erase me again. This very statement, but it is what it is.
Yeah, I think the academy sucks. The ivory tower sucks. And I think that's where I think a lot about ethnic studies now, and I think about this emergence of Asian American studies and how we're purportedly the connection between the academy and the community. And oftentimes that doesn't happen. And I think through events like these, I mean, if we were in person, this would be a feast, right? Like it would be a reading and a feast and a dinner and a gala and this beautiful event where people are brought together and we're able to celebrate. And instead we are, and I think, as a symptom of whiteness and white supremacy, we are wrought with dealing with the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States, right? And so I'm that coupled with, and I think that coupled with the way in which, we're making, it's, yeah, go ahead, Anjun.
Can I just add one more thing? I know I've been talking a lot, but, this past year, there's been this celebration that somehow, like college students in California are somehow going to be required to take ethnic studies to graduate, right? And there seems to be this celebration that's happening. I want to talk about. I just want to put in a little note about a culture of diversion, right? And that is what's happening in our society. Critical race theory ethnic studies as a requirement. All these things are diversion, and I celebrate the fact that ethnic studies is doing this work, and good for them. But let me say something about that, which is that students don't need just to study ethnic, class through ethnic studies to graduate. They need to study race in the context of departments like the creative writing department, like business department, like business and physics and sciences. They need to, that has to be a part of the conversation in all of these other, neck of the woods, not just like, and the truth is you put that,
I agree.
put that on us, and you say that we're responsible for somehow, guiding them through that quagmire. I think my colleagues need to study some ethnic studies themselves. They need to study how to teach race.
Oh my God. I feel like there's like an origin story kind of prompt about fighting with systems. And how what's so tragic about them is that they tend to be solitary battles where it seems like it's one person fighting against like the Goliath of X university or X department, but like these battles are real. And like I mean, like one very highly visible one is Nicole Hannah Jones not getting tenure at UNC Chapel Hill, right? And we get to see what it looks like. We get to see who the actual players of that. But those types of battles are happening all the time, and they're things that, I mean, they are violence in a lot of ways because these battles that seem to be about one's career, they get kind of couched as like personal career battles, but there's much more at play, and they're not sexy stories. They're not stories that people want to talk about or want to read about, but they are real, and they are and it's where you see some of the most virulent racism go down. And so I feel you. I mean, I definitely have my experiences too, and I will say that like writing about kind of structural battles that I'm having with like departments and things like that, I wasn't comfortable because it seemed so personal, but like I see it over and over and over again, and like this is something that, I mean, yeah, it is part of this whole struggle that we're talking about here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but yeah, to talk about inspiration, I mean, I have the folks that the classics like Baldwin and Maxine Hong Kingston and Audre Lorde, Saidiya Hartman and her work of like critical, fabulism has been super important to me because so much of, I mean, the truth is like as a Montagnard American writer, though, since we don't have books, I have to go to data. Like I have to go to ethnographies, and I have to rely on military accounts written by the French and by Americans in order to extrapolate our history as Montagnards. So the work of Saidiya Hartman is very inspirational to me for that reason, and it keeps me fed in a lot of ways. But a lot of friends, I will say that a lot of Southeast Asian writers are really inspirational, just because like just all the questions that they pose in their work are such vital questions about like how do you recover from devastating and deep trauma of war. Like, how do you live your life? How do you go forward? How do you envision a future if that's your past, right? Yeah, so I will say that like the writers that I worked with, I mean, both in Multiverses and Apocalypse Never have just, really inspired me tremendously, because they're asking those questions. They're asking vital questions and like not settling for easy answers. And I think that's what fighting is about.
Thank you both. Thank you for that. And how do you envision your future if that's your past? I think that's a beautiful question that my generation, and maybe Natalie's too, right? That our generation, the next generation, is going to reconcile with, because what happens when that past in this post memorialization, in the collective history and memory of who you are, of your community, becomes your past, whether you understand it and have lived through it or not. Natalie, on your inspirations, motivations, aspirations.
A lot of my inspirations come from my friends. If that kind of sounds cheesy, but my friends honestly inspire me like all the time, and seeing how active they are in using their voices and seeing how fearless they are. They honestly encourage me to push myself a lot more and get my voice out there and become louder and get more active. And like for me, I want to work in the field of like art and creative writing and like just creating artwork, which I've always been a little bit hesitant about, just because I know it is heavily dominated by white people and it is hard for Southeast Asians to sort of be visible in that aspect. But I like just seeing my friends and knowing that like the younger generations are becoming more and more active in trying to take control of their future. That has been very inspiring to me, and that is something that I want to do, because I feel like we can't afford to stay silent about our future at this point. So if we want it to improve, we have to get out there and make it happen. So
Thank you for that, Natalie. And with that, I'm gonna bring back on Liana. Welcome back, Liana, to the stream. Today is a reminder that today is a fundraiser for the Southeast Asian Development Center in the Tenderloin in San Francisco. So, Liana, you can talk a little bit more, remind the people what they're out here contributing to, make that plug.
Definitely. The Southeast Asian Development Center is located in the Tenderloin in San Francisco, and we have about 20 staff working to help with translation services, case management, food services, and education for our students and adults, and helping them getting people placed into jobs and other things like that. So basically, we just help at-risk youth, families, and immigrants from Southeast Asia or coming already here, help just assimilate to America and the kind of odd culture we have here, and just trying to get them to understand some of the odd rhetoric that we use, and trying to make it more fathomable for them in their own native language.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Liana. And I have one, with that, I mean, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We're running up on time. I've got one closing question for all of our panelists to wrap up our program today. And it is, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give yourself prior to that moment when you wrote your first piece? When you wrote your first poem, essay, created your first work of art, what advice would you give yourself? Just to pass on the torch to those who will watch this, who are watching this live and who will watch this later. I'm gonna start this one off with Natalie.
Yeah, I would probably tell myself that not everything has to be perfect. And that if you write something and it feels good to you and it feels like you're expressing yourself in an authentic way, that's perfectly okay. It doesn't have to be like professional. It doesn't have to be well-rounded. If it's something you like, go for it. So
Love it.
H'Rina?
I would say that, follow what makes you feel free and what makes you feel powerful. And have faith in it and just keep doing it. And that's it.
Thank you. And Andrew?
Throw that brick through a window. Break something. Break something. Really break something.
I love it.
Thank you all so much for being a part of the program for today. DVAN and Southeast Asian Development Center present Poets Fight Back. You can find us on social media, which are in the comments. Thank you again to Natalie Nong, H'Rina DeTroy, and Truong Tran for joining us as panelists. Thank you to Leanna and the Southeast Asian Development Center. And on behalf of DVAN and CDC, good night, and we will see you for our next live program here on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you
meeting
so
all
much.
of you.
Yes, it's been a pleasure.